everyone. You remember I got done with the the book that we've been reading, the miracles, the real miracles that happen. Well, I'm going to read this book here. It's like a kid's book. I'm going to read it now, a chapter. Try to do a chapter a day. It's the Hardy Boys, the Viking Symbol Mystery. So I'll read one chapter. I'm going to try to do one chapter a day till we're done. It's like old. How old is this? $1963. All right, so let's get started. Chapter 1, Radio Threat. Ooh. Dad, why did you want us to follow here for a meeting tonight? Asked blonde, 17-year-old Joe Hardy. Is it about one of your new cases? The speaker was Joe's tall, dark-haired, 18-year-old brother, Frank. Yes, I want you 5 boys to hear a radio report from Sam Radley. Fenton Hardy replied. Frank, warm up the 2-way shortwave radio. The tall, well-built private investigator glanced at his watch. It's almost 9, Sam. We'll be broadcasting any second. The other boys in the room were the Hardys' pals, stout, easygoing Chet Morton, lanky Biff Hopper, and bright-eyed Tony Pitro. The boys exchanged excited glances. A message from Radley, Mr. Hartley's operative, meant mystery. Just then, a crackling sound came from the receiver, and a voice spoke over the airwaves. Radley reporting. Investigation proceeding as planned. Latest episode is stolen float plane. Owned by guest. Suddenly, the voice faded. The signal's being jammed, Mr. Hardy exclaimed, grasping and turning knob into trying to clear the jumble of static. You remember how that is? I do. I'm old enough to know that. Always trying to get the right station in. Someone else must be using our wavelength. And remember the phones that you were on the same line with each other? You pick up the phone, you never know who might be on the other end. You've got a shared line. I don't even know if they do that anymore. As suddenly as it had started, the crackling disappeared. Then a strange, deep voice said, Stay away, Hardy. That's not Sam, Joe exclaimed, and others stared in astonishment. Shh. Frank leaped up and bent over the seat. The new voice continued, Hardy, stay away. You'll never get out of the Northwest Territories alive. The intruder became silent. There was only shrill static. For Pete's sake, I wonder who that was, muttered Chet. Mr. Hardy again adjusted the controls. The static cleared, and the familiar voice came on. Radley, signing off. Wait! Mr. Hardy commanded. Couldn't catch the last part of the message. Repeat. Can you hear me now? Yes. Radley went on. Yesterday, a float plane was stolen from the front of the lodge rear Yellowknife, single engine, collar brown. I will advise progress over and out. Another theft and a threat, Mr. Hardy said in a grim tone as he leaned forward and snapped off the powerful shortwave set. What will you do? Frank asked his father. As we waited for an answer, the group was startled by a sudden loud crash outside. Something's hit the garage, Joe cried out. He and Frank dashed from the study and down the stairs. Mr. Hardy and the other boys followed the brothers through the kitchen and onto the rear lawn. It's our shortwave radio antenna, Frank shouted, pointing to a high pole near the garage. From it dangled part of the Hardy's 3-element beam antenna, over which the detective sent long-distance messages. The rest lay in a jumbled mess of wreckage on the ground. What made it fall? Biff asked in amazement. Look, Joe cried, bending down. This was no accident. He held up a twisted strand of rope, one end of which was tied around the metal support. Why would anyone want to pull an aerial off the pole? Tony said, frowning. That's what I want to know, declared Mr. Hardy. Get flashlights and start a search for the vandals. I'll call Chief Kolig. Joe went into the house with his father, found 3 flashlights in the hall closet, and rushed outside. The boys beamed their lights on the pole, and Joe held a magnifying glass, trying to detect fingerprints, but found none. The vandal must have climbed the pole spikes to rig the rope, Frank commented, and he wore gloves, Joe guessed. The other boys fanned out over the grounds, hunting for signs of the trespasser, but found nothing. There were not even footprints, because the ground was hard and dry. Just as they turned back toward the house, a police car roared up the driveway, its red roof light flashing. The car stopped. The police chief, Ezra Kolig, stepped out. The Hardys rushed to meet him. "Have you found out who did this, Fenton?" the officer asked. "Not a clue." "I'm not surprised," said the tall, husky chief, who had worked closely with Mr. Hardy and the boys on several cases. "There has been some vandalism around Bayport lately. This probably is another example of it. Some prankster's idea of fun." Frank and Joe glanced at each other. "I'm afraid it has something to do with Dad's new case," the older boy said. Here's the picture of them with the pole and everything. "Well, maybe," the chief replied. "You would know better about that than I. Just the same, I'll be on the lookout for vandals." Excitingly speculating on the incident, the brothers and their pals were circling the house again, searching for clues, when they encountered a tall angler woman coming briskly up the walk. "Hello, Aunt Gertrude," Frank and Joe greeted their father's sister, who made her home with them. "Have a good time?" "Yes," she replied. "Our Ladies' Guild had an excellent rummage sale." She dug into her large handbag and brought out 2 belts with huge silver buckles. "I got these for you boys," Aunt Gertrude told her nephews. "Wow," said Joe, "some present." "Thanks, Auntie," the brothers said together, and Frank added, "Look at those silver buckles. They must be worth a fortune." He grinned appreciatively. Both Frank and Joe loved their aunt, despite the fact that at times her manner was somewhat peppery and her comments tart. As Chet, Biff, and Tony crowded around to admire the belts, Aunt Gertrude noticed Chief Kolig coming across the lawn with Fenton Hardy. The smile on her face changed to a worried frown. "Another mystery?" she asked. The boys explained about the antenna. To allay their aunt's fears, they emphasized the fact that Chief Kolig thought it probably was just a prank. Aunt Gertrude was not to be easily reassured. "Prank? It's a bad omen, more likely. I hope you'll be careful." "We'll watch our steps," said Frank, patting her shoulder. All the boys returned to Mr. Hardy's second-floor studio and continued talking of the evening events. When the detective joined them a few minutes later, he looked serious. "Time for me to give you the full story," he said. "It will concern each of you." The boys' excitement mounted as Mr. Hardy's words. "Sam Radley was broadcasting from Yellowknife in the Canadian Northwest Territories," Fenton Hardy exclaimed. "But we can't communicate now until we get the aerial installed. Radley's investigating a series of thefts which have been taking place at hunting and fishing lodges in the Great Slave Lake area. Rifles, canoes, outboard motors were stolen, and now even an airplane had been stolen. The owner of the lodges has retained me to find the thieves. Since I was tied up on something else, he agreed to let my assistant work on it." The detective paused, then continued, "Radley has been up there for some time, and now I think he needs help." "I'll go," each boy volunteered. Mr. Hardy smiled at the response. I'll need only 2 of you for the job. Biff and Tony, you can be on your way to home tomorrow. All expenses paid. If you solve the mystery," he added, "there'll be a bonus." Frank, Joe, and Chet looked puzzled. Why weren't they going along? Mr. Hardy smiled and continued, "Don't worry. You three, you're going to Canada too. I need your help on another important case." "What's that, Dad?" Frank asked eagerly, his face brightening. "A few days ago," Mr. Hardy explained, "I had a cablegram from a Mr. Black, curator of the City of London Museum in England. Because I'd been successful in solving a case in Canada a few years ago, I had been recommended to Mr. Black." "Yes?" Joe prompted. "This mystery," his father went on, "concerns an invaluable Viking ruined stone that was stolen recently in Edmonton, Alberta." "Wow!" exclaimed Joe. "That's near the edge of the Northwest Territories. Those old Scandinavian minaries, whatever that word is, really covered a lot of water in their far-flung travels," said his father, opening raging inland from great distances. "The runic alphabet was copied from Latin and Greek letters by the Teutonic peoples about the 3rd century. They left permanent messages on stones, and for many centuries afterward, this stone, one, had special significance." Mr. Hardy went on. "It seems a fresh Canadian trapper named Perry Caron found a stone bearing Viking symbols near the shore of Great Slave Lake. After revealing his find to the press, he contacted the London Museum, and the officials there sent an expert on runic symbols, Peter Baker Jones, to Edmonton to buy the stone for the museum's collection. The thieves probably read all about it in the newspapers. A few minutes after Mr. Baker Jones had paid Caron, both men were attacked and robbed. Baker Jones lost the ruined stone and Caron his money." "What about the Edmonton police?" Chet asked. "Are they working on the case?" "Yes, but despite their efforts and all the help they have had from Caron, they haven't been able to come up with a clue. Baker Jones is still in a coma." "Did the cablegram say anything else?" Frank asked. "That's all, Frank. I put through a transatlantic call to Mr. Black in London and suggested that the stone probably was already in the museum in Cairo for some other farewell world. Just before Baker Jones lost consciousness, he told a doctor that the ruined stones contained directions to a Viking treasure hidden in the area." I wonder what's in that treasure. I guess it's real. "And Mr. Black thought the thieves would stay around here to look for it?" Frank asked. "Right," his father said, smiling. "Great!" exclaimed Joe, leaping to his feet. "Then we're on the Viking ruined stone case?" "Right again," replied the detective. The 5 boys began talking excitingly about the 2 mysteries. Finally, Biff said, "Tony and I had better take off. We have a lot to do to get ready." "Good idea," Mr. Hardy agreed. Frank, Joe, and Chet hurried downstairs with the 2 boys. "Let's cut through the backyard and over the hedge," Tony suggested to Biff as they went outside. "Sure thing. It's the fastest way home." The Hardys and Chet waved goodbye to their friends, who hurried off across the yard. The 3 boys had just turned to go into the house when suddenly they heard a shout. "Help! Help! It's Biff!" Frank cried out. "Come on, fellows!" And that was chapter 1. It's getting exciting at the end, isn't it? But you don't get to see that till the next chapter. What happened? This is not my favorite reading this book. Kind of really bores me a little, but haven't found anything else for you guys to read yet, so.
Bores you, huh?
Yeah, bores me. So maybe tomorrow we'll get to another chapter. I hope you guys have a great rest of your night. And I hope you guys have a great night's sleep. Bye, guys.